Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Ogti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Aaron and Trishul discuss Safe Withdrawal Rate research, focusing on sequence of returns risk, how the returns in the first few years of withdrawals after retirement disproportionately affect the rest of your life. Given this importance, how do you balance short and long-term goals when taking current withdrawals that need to last your lifetime? By understanding spending, investment, and longevity risk, you can choose which planning risk you want to take on and how to make adjustments along the way. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Ogti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hey, how's it going, Aaron?
It is going well. How are you doing today, Trishul?
I am doing well.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about sequence of returns risk. This is a little more technical than some of our previous conversations, but it gets into how financial planners can provide advice to clients related to spending money and without making sure that they run out of money down the road. And the research has kind of started with the Safe Withdrawal Rate research. This we've talked about previously, but the idea that if you are in your early 60s and you want your money to last 30 years, then if you withdraw 4%, there's no historical example of you running out of money. And if you look into that research, you realize, oh, you could actually withdraw a little bit more in some years, but the fact that we don't know what the next 30 years is going to look like leads us to make the safe choice, not the average choice. The next level of research when it comes to retirement and safe withdrawal rates and using Monte Carlo simulations understands that the sequence of returns actually has a huge impact on the longevity aspect and on the ability for your money to provide for your lifestyle for your entire life. And what I mean by that sequence of returns is that if you were to retire in your early or mid 60s, if you get a few positive years, let's say you sit down with a financial planner, or even just you're doing it yourself using the Safe Withdrawal Rate research and you're only spending 4%, if you get a few years that are above average market returns, you get a plus 20, then a plus 15, and maybe just a plus 10, something like that. So your first few years are above historical averages. This would be like retiring in, say, 2003 or retiring in 2011 or 2013. So you just get those first few years are beyond what you expect. The research says that any risk you had of running out of money when you retired and followed a 4% safe withdrawal rate research, by getting those big years early, that risk is almost completely gone. If you maintain your lifestyle, there's almost no risk that you run out of money if you get those first 3 good years. But if those first 2 or 3 years are negative, you get say a negative 10 or a negative 15, or say it's flat 1 year, or it goes down 30 or 40%. If this is like I wanted to retire in 1999 or 2000, or I want to retire in 2007, then how does this hold up? And Safe Withdrawal Rate research kind of confirms that if you only withdraw 4%, you're probably going to be okay, but you're probably going to be on the track to run out of money in about 30 years. And so now the question becomes, okay, what happens if I live longer than 30 years? I don't want to have to choose to die at 95. I might live longer than that. And the way that we interpret this is, if we know that those first few years are so impactful to the longevity and preventing running out of money down the road, it also makes sense that those first few years of retirement should be the most conservative years when it comes to your investments. That's actually the time we want to take on the least amount of risk. But as we've also talked about previously, we need your money to last 30 years. We actually can't get too conservative. We can't just go into cash because we know inflation will eat away at your purchasing power. And if you're trying to maintain your lifestyle, you're going to eventually run out of money if you are too conservative. You can't just sit it in cash. You have to have some exposure to stocks and equities to make sure that your investments outpace inflation over those following 30 years. And so the conversation today is around this idea of, okay, if I understand that the sequence of returns matters, that those first few years are extraordinarily impactful to how my money lasts and supports my lifestyle for the rest of my life, given I don't know how long I'm going to live, but I can't get too conservative. How do I find that balance? And the first thing I want to ask you, Trishul, is based on my description, what are the first thoughts or even conflicting thoughts that come to mind for you?
First of all, I think a lot of what you say makes sense to me. And what it kind of highlights is the notion that a lot of what we try to do has this sort of mathematical step-by-step approach, but then each individual situation is a little different and there's all these competing concerns. So it's kind of like a balancing act that we have to play when we're working with a real life scenario. So it feels like it's part art and part science to come up with a solution that makes sense for an individual. Does that kind of make sense for what you've seen? Or do you think it is a lot more science oriented, meaning if you follow these steps, you should be okay?
It is more science related. The reason I say it, when it comes to the research, it is more science related, but it ends up being probability based. And that's what feels like the art side. And what I mean by this is when you look at pensions or life insurance or annuity companies and any large group that is planning on how does Social Security fund the money, how much money do they need to fund all the Social Security benefits that get paid out? When you introduce the law of large numbers, it's a mathematical idea that if you have a pool or sample big enough, you can actually plan around the averages pretty consistently. That any large pool of money, so if a pension fund is paying out for thousands of people, they can actually plan pretty consistently that, you know what, half the people are going to live past life expectancy of 78 to 81 to 85, depending on age and class, and half the people are going to pass away sooner. And so they can design their pension obligations that those who passed away sooner are kind of funding those who live longer. The problem is you can't make individual decisions based on that math.
Right.
And that's where the kind of the probabilities come in and the I guess it's art comes in, that while we can look at 1,000 65-year-olds and say, you know what, we're pretty confident that half of them are going to pass away before 85. The individual that's coming to us doesn't know which half they're going to be on. And so we have to plan for those longer time frames just in case you actually get to live that long. And this is one of those kind of like taxes. It's one of those good problems to have of, oh, you made a lot more money, so you owe a lot more in taxes. That's probably better off than losing money and saving on taxes. You're still always better off making more money, paying more in taxes. And for most people, they kind of prefer would to live longer and take on all those problems that come with living longer. So that's why I say it's not necessarily art per se. It's more probability based, and how individuals interpret this that does feel like art sometimes. That how you choose to follow the probabilities, it gets very difficult. And it's just one of the things that come up with human beings in general, that understanding compounding over 30 years, understanding probabilities are very difficult for the human mind, that it does kind of feel like art. And sometimes it's easier to follow some of these principles if it seems like an art more than a science. But there's still the math behind it. It's just the difference between law of large numbers in individuals and understanding how probabilities work, but also you can't live your life based on probabilities. You have to make a decision today for what you're going to do moving forward.
Right. Something that does come up with Monte Carlo simulations is when the machine does those simulations, what it tries to do is come up with a bunch of different scenarios that could potentially happen. And then you can actually interrogate those scenarios and say, out of these 1,000 scenarios that were just simulated, what percent of them ended up having the individual run out of money? And, let's say 95% of those scenarios were great. The individual did not run out of money and 5% did. Well, that may sound great to some people, but you may get a client that says, wait, there's a 5% chance I'm going to be on the street and broke. That doesn't sound too great for me. Well, what do you do about situations like that?
When clients ask about that 5%, it's important to make sure to educate them on how to use the Monte Carlo simulation as a tool. This is not a stone tablets determining exactly what they have to do for the rest of their life. It's a really helpful tool that it's understanding, okay, most of the time you're going to be fine. And in fact, in those scenarios where it's a 95% chance you don't run out of money, the most likely thing, the median case, is your money keeps growing and that you actually pass away with more money that you ever had in your life, and you leave that to kids or heirs or charity. But to protect against those 5% times that do, you have to acknowledge that you might have to make adjustments. And it's understanding the limitations of the Monte Carlo simulation. It requires hard, fast rules of here's how much you're going to spend, adjust it for inflation every single year for the rest of your life. But in reality, we can apply common sense of if we're on the track of those 5% scenarios, because we got those negative years early on, it will likely require some adjustment. Either you have to reduce spending for a few years. Maybe it might be on the scale of you reduce spending by 10% for a year or two. Sometimes that's all it takes. It might be you change the timing of some of your discretionary spending. So we planned in you were going to buy a car, but you know what? The market's down. We don't want to take an extra withdrawal. So we're going to pay for the repair of the transmission. And then we'll look at getting a new car 2 or 3 years later. And so, or you want to do this big vacation, maybe we just push this off a little bit. Other ways are actually taking advantage of kind of reversion to the mean when it comes to investments of if they are down, we actually might want to change our asset allocation and get more aggressive. Maybe we put more into stocks and equities, and the resulting reversion to the mean actually will likely get us back on track. It might take several years, but that's one of the ways that we could get back on track without necessarily changing spending. It's increasing investment risk if you have to feel comfortable taking that on, but from a planning risk perspective, from a Monte Carlo, from a withdrawal rate research, that actually might be more effective to helping you get back. And so here's where I use Monte Carlo simulations with clients. It's not, okay, it's 95% and we're good. You don't have to worry about anything. It's tracking that each year as we look at your spending, your savings, your withdrawal rate, and then what your investments returns were. And if we see it get worse, that's something that we can see kind of 20 years before it becomes a problem. We're going to make one super tiny tweak right now to make sure that we don't keep going on that path to go down to that 5%. And so when clients ask, am I going to run out of money? Is there a 5% chance? It's like, well, realistically, probably not. We'll have made some other adjustment 20 years prior to make sure we don't go down that path. But it is helpful understanding, okay, what scenarios could come up in the next few years that would put you down that path. And that's why it's still valuable. And it's still really important to run that Monte Carlo simulation, but not take it as gospel and understand that this is just a tool.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Just out of curiosity, do you target 95%, or is that just also a number that can change based on the situation?
There's definitely I like that using the phrase planning risk, that some clients feel more comfortable taking on more planning risk and some clients don't like that idea. And for most clients, there ends up being a sweet spot lower than that. Because as I said, if you have a 95% chance that you never have to make an adjustment and a 5% chance you have to make an adjustment, then the most likely thing is that your $1 or $2 million actually becomes like $8 or $10 million when you pass away. That you see significant growth on your overall assets. But if we get too low, then we kind of introduce the idea that, okay, we're going to be going with the swings of the market kind of thing, where your spending is determined by how your investments do from one year to the next. And that's probably a Monte Carlo below 50%. And so I try to describe to clients that if they wanted a Monte Carlo in the 60 to 80% range, where over half the time, maybe 60 to 70, 80%, you never have to make an adjustment to your lifestyle. This will feel most likely of kind of living off of your principal without going below it. And about a quarter, there's a 25% chance that you will have to make some kind of adjustment to get back on track. And this adjustment could be, like we talked about, reducing spending by 10 or 20% for 1 or 2 years every decade. And that's a realistic possibility, that if you wanted to go on a big vacation every year, there's a decent chance that one of those years you have to skip the vacation. And that allows them to target a withdrawal rate maybe closer to 4.5% or 5%. And if they understand those risks, they acknowledge going in that they're okay making an adjustment based on future investment return. But some clients really are more conservative. They don't want to have to change their lifestyle depending on the investments. And so we do target a Monte Carlo above 90%. And it's okay. We're going to design an investment strategy that's going to balance these risks that you feel comfortable with and the ones that you don't feel comfortable taking on. And we're going to make sure that you don't run out of money and you get to live the lifestyle you want. And you end up with a withdrawal rate around 4% or even lower than that. And the most likely thing is that your money just keeps on growing. And so you feel safe and secure throughout your entire retirement. And there's a lot of value in that feeling of safety and security that some clients prefer. They would rather feel safe and secure and never have to worry about it and leave a lot of money to their kids than to have any worry from one year to the next of paying attention to investments. And It's personal preference depending on the client, and I help clients manage both of those. Some of them, like, oh, I can spend more on my vacation this year. I've never been to Europe. I want to try that out. Or I've been looking at this cruise or a safari, and if I can spend a little bit more, I'm okay taking on those other future planning risks.
I think that really helps explain things. So basically, you have a process where the simulations and the probability estimates that go into them can give you some understanding of how likely a client will need to change things if they happen to experience a poor sequence of returns.
Correct.
And based upon that, then it's not like the client will be on the street, but it might involve just tweaks or changes that the client will likely have to make. And depending on how often we expect those changes to occur, whether they should occur, 1 in 100 times or 1 in 4 times, will depend on how often the simulation says that they'll run out of money. And aligning the preferences of the clients with what is realistic seems like an important part of the process. But do you ever run into situations where it turns out that not only does the client want security, but they just don't have enough to make it work?
Yes. And anytime we talk to a kind of anytime financial planners talk to each other behind the scenes, it's in terms of the math, it's always you have to reduce the time frame of retirement. So instead of needing money for 30 years, you have to get it down to 25. You can either do this by working a little longer or dying sooner. You can't really control one of those. So so you can suggest to clients that they consider working a little longer. We could suggest reducing lifestyle expenses and figuring that part out, or understanding the different risks they can take on. And this is harder, but it is possible to do it by taking on more investment risk or more planning risk. And what I mean by this is if they are more aggressive with their investments, then that actually could be enough to support the slightly greater withdrawal rate. And they're increasing that sequence of returns risk. They are making they're introducing more risk that they see a -20, -30% in those first few years. And so if they really want to retire and they have this lifestyle that they want to live, then you put together a plan. Okay, what's going to happen if we get a -30 next year? You will have to make an adjustment. Do you want to go back to work? Do you want to find a kind of a side job that you want to do? Do you want to reduce your lifestyle significantly? You have to have a plan in place, but you don't have to decide to do that right away. You can say, I'm only going to do that if the investments go down. But if the investments don't go down, then they theoretically could support that greater withdrawal rate. Another factor that can come into play, and this is newer research related to retirement, is that a default assumption in Monte Carlo simulations and safe withdrawal rate research is that your expenses go up with inflation over time. And we'll use a CPI number, and there's decent data of long-term correlations between equities and inflation, and even interest rates and inflation on a long enough time frame. But it's starting to look like as people get into their 70s, 80s, and 90s, their spending actually slows down. It doesn't go down, it doesn't go negative. They don't reduce their spending, but it doesn't increase as fast as inflation. So this would be considered a negative real growth. So real is a term where you're comparing nominal rates of return to inflation to get a real rate of return. So older clients, this is actually about a wide scale based on retirement research. In everything except healthcare, they actually tend to see their spending go down. They're just not traveling as much. They're not going out as much. Some other retirement researchers have dubbed these the go-go, slow-go, and no-go years, that they just become a little bit more sedentary. And if you have this in mind, that it's okay to spend a little bit more early on because it's likely to reduce in the future, that can be another way that they can retire now, having a slightly higher withdrawal rate, having a higher planning risk, having a lower Monte Carlo simulation percentage, and it can still work out. Most likely what's going to happen in these cases is if they have $1.2, $1.5 million, but they want to live off of $100,000 a year, and we count Social Security, they're probably going to be spending down that amount in their 80s, and they're going to leave less money to kids. We might look at kind of different annuity strategies later on, kind of if the sequence of returns risk what went against them and they get to 85 and they have $600,000 left, then we turn that into an annuity that supports their mandatory expenses for the rest of their life. So there are ways around that they have to understand those planning risks going in. It's not undoable. And sometimes it really is just, you know what, you need to work 3 more years and save an extra $100,000 to $200,000. Sometimes it really is just that clear. It's like, no, the risk is too high. You really do need to work a little bit longer. And for those, in those cases, even sometimes they don't necessarily have to make the same salary that they're making now. Sometimes it's just delaying the time they make that first withdrawal might be all they need. They don't necessarily need to add to their savings. They just need to reduce the years that they're withdrawing, and delaying that first withdrawal a few years is also helpful. So maybe they find a different job that's a little more fulfilling, that they're just a little happier, that they can see themselves doing for a few more years in their 60s. That sometimes that works out also.
That makes sense to me. I recall you mentioning there's even some research that says that people who delay retirement a little longer actually lower their chance of mortality a bit, simply because they're less sedentary. So that might be worth it just for that standpoint alone.
Yes, and that was something that was really interesting, is that it's not saying it's a causation per se, but there does seem to be a correlation between maintaining an active life helps live longer, and a more sedentary life correlates with less longevity. And going into work forces you to maintain an active life. There's other benefits that they think are related. It's just having a social community of people you work with, kind of requiring cognitive stimulation. And there are other ways to get these same benefits without necessarily having to go into work. So it ends up becoming a very case-by-case basis. If you can be just as active, have the social network and community, what we talked about a while ago in our well-being, the friends, family, and community aspect, and you feel this, like, you keep your mind active and you're mentally stimulated, that can simulate all the same things as work, and you get kind of the same longevity benefits. But for a lot of people in our country, when they stop working, they get significantly more sedentary. And that's where that research kind of points to.
So in terms of providing advice on the the life planning spectrum, just talking more about the overall big picture, it seems like there may be a win-win here in terms of if individuals feel comfortable working a little bit longer at a far reduced salary even, but just enough to keep the withdrawals from the retirement accounts lower for a little longer, might provide not only health benefits, but also increase the chances that an individual will be able to sustain risks associated with a poor sequence of returns.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the ideas. There's a few ways to kind of plan for that, the sequence of returns risk, and working a little longer is one of those. And like you mentioned, in terms of life plan, this gets to why do people want to retire? Because there's a difference between financial independence and retirement. In our previous episode, we talked about the idea that sometimes there are people who are financially independent who choose to continue to work because they find value and meaning in going to work. And they're happy about it. That they're making that conscious choice. They're not just working just to save until they can retire. And that definitely does help with sequence of returns risks. It helps build up more savings, helps reduce the years that we're going to be withdrawing from investments. Another strategy could be using cash balances. We look at that's the time to be most conservative. And when I say conservative here, I actually mean truly in terms of investment asset allocation. So I recommend to clients that the years immediately prior and after retirement should be the most conservative they are. Early on in life, we're going to be more aggressive. We want to just see it grow as high as we can. We don't need it for decades, so we get as much stock and equity exposure as we can. But as we get close to retirement, that's where we're going to have the largest fixed income allocation. This could be bonds, it could also be cash. And in those first few years of retirement, we're going to be paying attention to that asset allocation and possibly not rebalancing. And there's really good research related to why this could come into play, is that if our stocks go down, it's not using a bucket strategy. It is consciously rebalancing, but paying attention to that asset allocation. And so if you retire and we have 60% in stocks, 40% in bonds and cash, if stocks go down, then we make sure we're taking money from our bonds and cash and buying more stocks. And we're taking advantage of reversion to the mean so that when markets recover, that ends up being a greater percentage of our portfolio. But if stocks are going up, then maybe we don't have to rebalance. Maybe we keep our cash and equity at the same level because they're not going to go up as much as stocks do in general. But that might be a time where we don't rebalance. And that's how we can choose to match that longevity concern and make sure that we do have equities outpacing inflation, but we have taken on the kind of most conservative strategy in those few years that we need to be the most conservative. And that sometimes is a way to match clients' long-term goals with the math saying that we have to be most conservative in that short-term time frame. And this can work for different clients and focusing on that asset allocation, because when it comes to sequence of returns, one of the worst things is if your investments go down 20% and you withdraw 5%, so now you're down 25, you need 33% to get back up to where you were. But if you don't get 33 the next year, and let's say you stay even flat, but you still withdraw 5% of your original, because this is what you need to live off of, that compounding of, okay, I only have 60% of what I started at, and I need to get back up to where I started just to support my lifestyle. That's where the sequence of returns gets really, really difficult to overcome. That it's when you're in accumulation and you get those down years, you just don't touch it and wait a few years, wait several years, and it'll go back up. But when you're in retirement and you have to take money out of that portfolio, those first few years are unfortunately extremely impactful if they're negative. And that's all we're looking to protect against. And so if this goes negative, we just withdraw from cash and bonds, and we end up with a more aggressive portfolio 2 years down the road. And so if we take all our withdrawals from the fixed income side, so that maybe we started at 60-40, but we saw 2 negative years, we withdraw our cash from the bond side, from the fixed income side, maybe we're at 70-30 or 80-20, so that when there's a recovery, when we see that natural reversion to the mean, we're participating in a greater effect. Does that make sense to you, Trishul?
Yeah, that's some good advice. Basically, what you're saying is to help moderate issues that come around with sequence of returns, you can not only change stuff on your spending side, as you previously discussed, but you can also think of changing up your investment strategy a bit to help navigate those waters as well, should you find yourself in that boat. So there are things you can do from both perspectives.
It usually ends up being kind of 3 big factors. One is investment risk. We can get more aggressive, more conservative. One is spending related, and the other is longevity related. The idea of like just working longer also compounds with the idea of you're withdrawing less. But you could theoretically retire and still just choose to live off of less money. So there's an interplay between working longer and spending less. But in terms of the math, they usually have those 3 variables.
Right.
I joke around that to solve Social Security, there's really kind of only 3 things that matter when it comes to the math. You either reduce benefits, which would be either delaying Social Security or literally reducing dollars, or even lowering that inflation adjustment. So reducing benefits, increasing taxes, or getting a greater rate of return. Those are kind of the only 3 things that you can do to fix Social Security. And how you choose those 3 things is a very political conversation. And that's, I don't know how that will be resolved. But it's a similar idea with retirement savings and financial independence. You can either work longer, get a greater rate of return, or save or reduce spending. Those tend to be the kind of the 3 choices.
Right. And it's some combination of those that'll likely be what an individual will end up doing. Some permutation of those 3.
And that's where the kind of the art comes into play. It's like, okay, right, I'll take on just a little more risk because I don't want to go 100% stocks. And some people just, their life is worse when the stock market goes down 5%. Like their heart palpitating, and they don't like that. So, okay, we won't do on the investment side. Can you work an extra year? It doesn't even have to be in your current job. Just find a job that you find easy and fulfilling, that you enjoy, and that helps reduce spending. And so there's a variety of different factors, but other people are like, no, I gotta get out. I'm done. I'm too busy with all of my volunteer activities. Let's take on the investment risk. I'm okay with that.
That makes sense. One component that I wanted to touch upon, you brought up as well, is the notion that healthcare spending is increasing higher than inflation. I'm wondering how you account for that, especially with the notion of having a long-term care program. I know that's something that many clients may value. But the cost for such a program are also increasing pretty greatly. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are around this topic.
This is a great question. There's a difference between healthcare spending and long-term care, and the increases in healthcare do tend to be less than the decreases in all the other spending. So this was accounted for. And it's actually one of those overall, so healthcare spending for people in their 80s and 90s is greater than inflation. All the other things are significantly less than inflation, if not even slightly negative. And so the net between those, because healthcare spending is only a percentage of overall spending, usually somewhere between 5 and 25%, which 25% is a huge number, but there are examples of that it still is a net that the overall overall spending is less than inflation. So even though healthcare is greater, the other things go down by more than that. And so what you see it, retiree spending is less than national averages across all ages. Long-term care specifically is one of the biggest risks to running out of money. That for people who have a high Monte Carlo percentage, a high probability of never having to make an adjustment, a need in a long-term care facility is the most likely thing to significantly deplete their assets. And maybe 10 years ago, maybe even as late as 7 or 8 years ago, long-term care insurance made a lot of sense for a lot of people. But part of the issue that came up was that long-term care insurance companies were possibly mispricing their policies. And we think that they were including an assumption that a certain number of people would stop paying premium, because they've seen this with life insurance policies pretty consistently, that say 5 to 10% of people just let their policies lapse. They just, you know what, I don't need any more, they'll let it go. And so that helps their math. But no one was letting go of long-term care insurance policies. So there's a little bit of mispricing there. And here in California, one of the things we saw a few years ago was anyone with a long-term care insurance policy was getting a letter saying we had to go to the California Department of Insurance, and across all clients of this long-term care insurance company, we have to either raise your premiums or reduce your benefits. And they actually had to get approval from the state of California insurance commissioner, with basically the idea is that if they didn't do this, the insurance company would go bankrupt. And so no one gets any benefits 20 years later. So they actually did get approval of everyone either saw their premiums go up or their benefits reduced. And so what we're seeing now is long-term care insurance policies, while they're probably priced correctly, they're really expensive. Something on the scale of like $15,000 for a couple. And it will probably not even cover all of the need. And so this is an important part of the conversation, where do you look at these long-term care insurance premiums, or do you kind of use your assets to cover that? And what would it look like if we did had a long-term care need? One of the things to factor in is that, unfortunately, most people who do need a long-term care need, or they have to go to a long-term care facility, they tend to pass away on the scale of 3 years. They're close enough to the end of life that the costs tend not to be that impactful for that long. Now, it's still, a long-term care facilities cost $100,000 per year in the Bay Area. I mean, it's really expensive. But if it's going to cost $300,000 over the last 3 years of their life, it is less likely that they'll become destitute. It's just more likely that there's less inheritance. And this ends up being part of the math that I help clients look at when looking at the idea of self-insuring, is that, okay, if we've done that 95% or If you've taken on something in the sweet spot of 60 to 80%, then what will likely happen is if there's a long-term care need, we're probably okay, but there's going to be a lot less for heirs. And it sometimes is okay to take on that risk. You also might get into things like, okay, if they own a home, then that's when we're going to use a reverse mortgage or even just sell the home if you're not in it. And this is one of the things I have seen. There's a growing market of retirement communities that are kind of pre-assisted living facilities. So they'll have one side of the compound is just really nice apartments that's almost like a hotel. They take care of laundry and house cleaning. They provide food. They have dining halls, and it's a social community for people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. The other side of the same compound is assisted living and nursing care and nursing homes. And this is where you generally have 24-hour medical care on the floors or on within the facilities. You have doctors on staff. And these types of places are actually very, very expensive. Costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to get into, and still costs several thousands of dollars per month in rent. So most people, before they do this, they sell their home and use the equity in their home to buy into these facilities. And kind of, if they're going to live there anyways, they don't need to keep that asset. And that ends up becoming part of that conversation for many clients of, okay, we had all of these assets that are providing for us your retirement lifestyle, and then you also have your home or maybe something else that you're just planning on leaving to kids. Maybe if a long-term care need comes up, then now they don't get any of that. That ends up being the most likely balance, because if we're using Monte Carlo simulations and safe withdrawal rate research to make sure that you don't run out of money over your lifetime, there's still going to be an amount of money in your 90s. Because again, even in your 90s, we don't know if you're going to live past 100, 105. So we still want to have a big buffer that will support the next 10 to 15 years. That ends up becoming the same buffer that pays for long-term care. That we don't ever actually let our clients run out of money. We don't say, oh, great job, we're going to run out of money at 96 because you're going to pass away at 95. So we're on track for that. We kind of make these adjustments along the way related to spending and investments, and we see their withdrawals go down, or realistically, their withdrawals don't go up even though inflation goes up. And so they end up with this buffer towards the end of life that could support a long-term care need if they needed to.
Great, Aaron. That makes a lot of sense. And it's really good to know that at the end of the day, even when people are in their de-accumulation stage, that if they happen to see a poor sequence of returns, there are many things that can be done to help mitigate these types of concerns. And there are many things that we can think about or strategies that we can follow to handle all these various scenarios that may come up, be it from handling long-term care or handling what to do about the notion that you just live longer than most people, or the notion that you ended up with some sort of exogenous event that you didn't expect. It seems like a lot of these things can be handled in a case-by-case basis depending on what comes up, even though at the time of formulating the initial plan, you may not be 100% certain that you're going to succeed with that specific plan until you die.
Yeah, and this is one of kind of the ongoing themes among financial advisors on Twitter, is that kind of we don't know what the future is going to look like. We need to have a good plan in place, and we're going to change it every single year. It's as soon as we go a month past when the plan was written, we're going to update it based on life and event and other events and investments. And it's you don't get to ignore the first part. You don't get to skip the first part. That initial plan is incredibly important because we don't know what the future is going to entail. But we can't just rely on just that static plan. We have to keep making these little adjustments, little tweaks along the way to make sure that we're always staying on track. And that's really what plays out with every single client. It's you need to spend the time and understanding up front, but that is not gospel. You have to continually stay focused on what are the factors that go into this and how do we make adjustments depending on what actually happens.
Right. I think it was Rumsfeld who said, war is not about coming up with a plan, it's about planning. It's about the process.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense to me.
This was a great conversation. Went actually a little deeper than I expected. I thought it was going to be a little more technical, but you had some great questions. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. I think you gave a good understanding of what's involved in these types of processes. And I think it provides our listeners with a good idea of all the stuff that goes into coming up with a plan and then how that plan evolves over time. So good stuff, Aaron. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for listening, and I appreciate you tuning in to our show today, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. Of course, if you liked what you heard, do subscribe to our podcast, and thanks again.
Thanks, Trishul.
Okay, thanks, Aaron.
Bye.
Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.